This one meeting is going to be about scope avoiding the rabbit hole. So the wanted to start off this presentation with a quote. I heard this. Michelangelo said this long time ago, and it made me think of scope. The sculpture is already complete within the marble block before I start my work. It is already there. I just have to chisel away the superfluous material. I think that was a great quote when you think about scope, because scope is that it's about only getting the gist of what you need and nothing more. So that's this quote. If you want to think of scope, think of this quote. This is a really good way to think about quote. But what is scope? Scope is the term that you'll see a lot when you're writing. You'll see a lot when in your project scope, your publishing industry. You see a lot of people say scope. Essentially, the scope is, you can boil it down just a few words: all the reader needs and no more. This could be the end of the presentation, but obviously it's not that easy. It's really hard to know what the reader needs and no more. And here's another one: in depth, yet not verbose. Now, you can say in depth, which everybody sort of understands what in depth is, but not too much in depth, not verbose, going over the board. The key with scope is maintaining that balance, maintaining that single focus that you have. It's kind of like staying in the tunnel of just going along the line and just not going crazy. All right, so I've added a few images in here to get a little bit crazy, to show you some to spice it up a little bit. So the first thing I try to think is these analogies to use of, well, what would be good analogies to show scope? The first thing I thought of was a cluster bomb. With a cluster bomb, it's bad. A cluster bomb just sprays all kinds of munitions all over the place when they bomb a site, versus something like a precision guided bomb, which is precisely controlled. It's surgical, exactly to the right location that the missile needs to go to. Lots of people use the cluster bomb approach. They think, I'm just going to, because I don't know, Adam tells me I need to be in depth, I'm just going to go crazy and follow all these different areas and paths and explain everything. And before you know it, the post is 5,000 words. We have a minimum word count for a reason. We should probably have a maximum word count to keep the content, keep the scope better. So less cluster bomb, more precision guided missile. Next, rabbit holes. Don't do it, little guy. The rabbit hole is, if you're not familiar with the concept of the idiom of a rabbit hole, it's essentially means, you're going down, you're talking about something, and then you completely go off on a tangent and start going down completely something else. You're going down the rabbit hole. You're going down into a spot to where it's probably related in some way because you connected the concept some way in your head. But at the end of the day, it's just a rabbit. You're going down the hole. You don't need to go there. You need to stay up into your, stay on course with the scope and exactly what you're supposed to in the article. But there's always a but here. I say don't go down the rabbit holes, but the next one is don't ignore the rabbit holes. I know that you're probably getting some mixed signals here, and it's honestly, scope is really hard to explain until you get into it and you kind of understand. So what I mean by here with this, don't ignore the rabbit holes, is write in scope. This is what some publishers and some other people will say: don't ever go down the rabbit holes at all. Don't ever talk about any of the tangents related to it. Just specifically focus on exactly what you want to speak about. However, because I think all ATA blog posts should be in scope, but they also were supposed to teach tangential things. So, when a reader comes to a blog post, a technical blog post, they should be reading it. They should come in and say, how to plant a flower. And as they go along, they're noticing step one, how to plant a flower. Okay, we're digging up the dirt, putting in the seeds. And then as you write, as you, the writer, will go along and, showing how to plant that flower. There's times when you can have asides like, You may be thinking, oh, by the way, the technique you put in, there's a lot of different techniques you can do this. Here's how you do, each of these techniques. You wouldn't go down into details, but they're kind of like asides, or here's a little quick tip on how to, make it grow faster or longer or something like that. They're just asides. So I kind of thought about that in a concept as like a tree with branches. You have your main trunk, which is your scope, exactly what you want to write about. And then instead of completely ignoring all the rabbit holes, I really think that a technical blog post, especially in the context of an ATA blog post, is call outs. So, oh, by the way, this other thing here would be great to know along this topic. These are call outs in Notion. So that's what you should really try to focus on, is maintaining the trunk, staying in scope, but like sprinkle kind of call outs as you go along. That way the reader learns to, learns about what they're here to come for, they came here for, but at the same time, you give them opportunities to learn more related things. But since they are just related, they're not in scope, those should just be call outs with links. You can also use that's what we use a lot of the links, the external sites. Essentially, you just want to be the guide to keep the reader going on their way when they browse around on the internet. So I think the scope and the call outs as branches are a really good way to kind of think about how to write around scope. All right, staying in scope. Back is the reader persona. Everyone is going to get tired of the reader persona, but if you don't know the reader, you can't write for the reader. The reader persona is by far and away the most important because that defines the scope. How does it define the scope? Well, the reader, you want to, let me give them a good example. If the reader comes in and the reader has, I don't know, they already know about how to the PowerShell 101 basics. They know how to create a file or registry entry or start a service, or just like they know the basics. And then if it's an article on, I don't know, how to provision a Hyper-V VM or with PowerShell, you don't want to go down, if you know the reader ahead of time, along with prerequisites, you want to go down the rabbit hole of, here's PowerShell, here's the history of PowerShell, here's how you do these things with PowerShell, here's how it's same with Hyper-V. Here, the Microsoft Hyper-V is blah, blah, blah. You go down through all that, what it is. The reader doesn't want to hear all that stuff because they already know it. So that also comes in, really complements prerequisites, because to me, I say here, dividing the rabbit holes up front. One of the reasons that you have prerequisites is to define all those branches to some degree, so you can tell them, hey, this is going to be related, but I'm not going to actually go down all these things. If you want to meet, if you're going to follow along here, set up these things, and it's kind of to set placeholders or like labels to those rabbit holes, so you don't go down them. And next, stick to the title and keyword. This is by far and away the most important. I'll have a few examples here, but essentially you think of the title, right? I guess we do it right here. How to make a file read-only and vice versa. The how-to ones, the titles, the articles with how-to, those are the most defined. Those are the most granular. Whenever you try to explain a blog post to somebody and it's called how to make a file read-only and vice versa, how would you demonstrate or describe that article? Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, they want to know how to make a file. You just kind of naturally feel like whenever you describe that, you're going to describe that as the same title. It's the how to is very granular. That's the title. You stick to the title, how to make a file read only and vice versa. Well, the company, they're going to obviously come in here. They're going to click on that title. They're going to know how to make a file read only. Well, that could be in the GUI, that could be in PowerShell, it could be in a lot of different, different ways. So I can break that all down in the next example. And then here, finally, the call outs, not paragraphs. That's another big thing to stay in scope. If you feel like the reader needs to know about something, but you kind of think in your head, well, this really isn't technically, this doesn't relate to the title directly or the section header that you're in. Call outs, not paragraphs. Don't write a paragraph. Just kind of spawn fork a branch or fork a some kind of process on the side, like a call out, say, oh, by the way, this, oh, as an aside, this, sprinkle those out throughout your article to kind of get that out of your system, and not go down there, just kind of put labels as call outs, and just don't write, entire paragraphs on things that aren't really in scope. All right, so we're going to go through 3 examples. First one, I just picked these at random from the blog, how to make a file read-only and vice versa. First up, to define scope, what does the reader want to learn? In this case, in my opinion, title says it all. They want to learn how to make a file read-only and vice versa. There's a lot of different contexts in there. That's where the in-depth part of an ATA blog post comes into play. Because when you just say how to make a file read-only and vice versa, that could be many different things. That could be in Windows, that could be in Linux, that could be in lots of different areas. So whenever I come up with the article titles like this, I really try. Sometimes I fail, but usually I try to make this to where the title is explicit as possible and knows exactly what's going to happen. So in this case, if you would go and start off with, well, what does the term read only mean? And you go down through that entire rabbit hole, that's not the way to go. Versus if you had sections like setting the read only file attribute with PowerShell, setting the read only file attribute with Windows Explorer, that's clear, that's explicit, that's exactly what you're going to do. And that way, those are the different contexts in the overall scope of how to make a file read only and vice versa. That's the sections will define context in that. PowerShell, Windows Explorer. I mean, you could even go into Linux. That would be perfectly acceptable for a scope with this title. All right, next is a little bit different article. What is PowerShell and why use it? We struggled with this one in editing, but I think I learned a lot by doing that, because normally an ATA blog post is about how to do something. A practitioner gets their hands dirty and goes through a demo. This one is not that. What is PowerShell and why use it? There is no how in there. That's what and why. This one, first ask yourself, what does the reader want to learn? Every ATA blog post is all about learning something. So the first question you should ask yourself is, what does the reader want to learn? And what the hell is this PowerShell thing? That's exactly what they want to learn. They have no idea what PowerShell is. If they're saying, what is PowerShell? They've never used it in their life. They may have just heard the term. You can assume a lot of things about the reader persona in there. So in my opinion, they just want to know, what the hell is this PowerShell thing? And why do I want to use it? So knowing that, based on that, from defining that scope from the title, then you can answer the reader's question. Well, it's not going to be in-depth comparisons to VB script, because you could go down that route of, well, here's how VB script compares to PowerShell. Here's how batch compares to PowerShell. Here's how, whatever else compares to PowerShell. That has nothing to do with what is PowerShell and why use it. That's not in the scope. Now, this would be a decent call out to where if you're listing out something of saying PowerShell is this thing and has this features, and it has this feature. Oh, and this feature is similar to how you do this thing in VB script. That would be a call out. It's always good to give the reader analogies, because that helps them learn more. So if they may know VB script coming in, they don't know anything about PowerShell, you can create those relationships and define those analogies between the two are really good ways to help them learn. And then an entire section on PowerShell history. The history of anything is not going to be in any ATA post, because we want every ATA blog post shows action. It shows how to do something. Even this, what is PowerShell and why use it? It strips away all the unnecessary from all that, and it trims exactly what they down. Somebody's coming into what is PowerShell and why use it. They want to use that somehow. Eventually, they want to use that in their job or wherever. They're not going to want to know an entire section of PowerShell history. If they wanted to know that, they would probably click on a title that says, 10 years of PowerShell history, or something like that for some kind of research project. Every ATA blog post should be as actionable and as concise as possible. Some of the good uses, some of the good maybe section headers for what is PowerShell and why use it. PowerShell use cases. Goes back to the action, using the thing. PowerShell use cases. How do I use it with Hyper-V? How do we use it with files? How do I use it with the cloud? How do I use it with this? That would be a really good section. Unique features to PowerShell, because they may be coming from another scripting language and they don't know anything about PowerShell. This would be a good section to do that kind of call out comparison. Well, it's kind of like VB script in this, where it's kind of like this. But the PowerShell pipeline is this unique feature over here. You explain it, but you don't go down the rabbit holes. Next, how to use PowerShell in various job roles. This is a really good one too, because you may an IT pro may come in, a software developer may click on that. I want to know what PowerShell is. A DevOps engineer, automation engineer. There's lots of different sysadmin. There's different job roles that would come in to use this. We use PowerShell because it's native on all Windows machines. So everybody has it for the most part. And to be able to break that down into various job roles, that's another good section that would be in scope. All right, and then finally, getting started with Azure Functions tutorial example-driven guide. First question, what does the reader want to learn? Well, they're probably thinking in their head, well, my boss told me about this thing, or I heard it on Twitter that there was this serverless thing called Azure Functions. Reader persona, number one, getting started. They don't know much at all about Azure Functions. They may have played with it themselves a little bit, don't know much about it. They're very new to it. So in that regard, going back to the action to stay in scope, you want to teach them the basics of just Azure Functions. You're not going to go into what is serverless, because they probably don't even know what serverless is. It would be good to have maybe a paragraph, just if they don't know what serverless is, maybe have a good paragraph, little one that says, serverless is the technology where blah, 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 you don't have servers to manage or whatever. But that would be a good call out to have a link to be of, hey, if you don't know what this, if you want to learn more about serverless, that would maybe a good link off to this. It wouldn't be an in-depth comparison to AWS Lambda, because in this case, they just want to know about Azure Functions. Sure, AWS Lambda is connected with Functions because it's another serverless technology, and maybe they are comparing both in their job role. But if they click on getting started with Azure Functions, they just want to learn Azure Functions. They don't want to know they don't want to go down any rabbit holes and to kind of build. They don't want to go down all those tangents of the history. It's related to this. It came from this, all that sort of stuff. And then using Azure Function in this super niche way, but I think it's cool. This is common for a lot of new writers before they kind of learn our style, because they come from a personal blog. So if you're on a personal blog and you want to say, getting started with Azure Functions, you may know a lot about Azure Functions and you found a way to use it in this really niche way that's specific to your environment, to specific to your context and exactly what you're going to do, that it probably won't apply to very many people at all. That's out of scope, because sure, it's cool. That would make a good call out and say, oh, by the way, I did this project and here's the GitHub link or something like that. That would be a kind of a neat aside, but it shouldn't be an entire section of here's how I create websites with Azure Functions that have a database, and then that database is built with a pipeline that had all these different little concepts and components to it. That is completely out of scope, and you should just kind of link off that and say, oh, by the way, here's this little cool thing that I work with that's, kind of as an aside. Good things. What is Azure Functions? Obviously, if you say getting started with something, maybe they know exactly a little bit what it is. It's not as explicit as saying, what is PowerShell, but same time, it's probably good to introduce that if it's a getting started guide. That's very in scope. Next, what are typical use cases of Azure Functions? Use cases are a big thing. Context, how you apply a concept in various situations, that's always good, because to be in depth, have a scope that's in depth, you always need to cover as many different use cases and contexts as you can that are, common. What are typical use cases? Well, You can, what are the typical use cases of any kind of serverless technology? Well, I don't have the money to, support infrastructure. I don't have the team to support the infrastructure. I just want to call an API to, create invoke a PowerShell script, whatever. So typical use cases are really good sections, and they are directly in scope because that relates directly to Azure functions. It doesn't kind of go off to the side. And then finally, obviously, how to create an Azure function. You start with getting started. You start with the what. Those getting started guys are more of the introduction at first to get used to it and understand what Azure Functions is and what it can do. And then finally, any good technical blog post ends up with, here's how you get hands-on with this thing and begin doing it. It wouldn't be, here's how to, I don't know, it wouldn't be to create an Azure function, but maybe here's how to create a website, which then creates an Azure function. Or you don't want to get too niche, but it's exactly in scope, kind of down that tunnel of just looking at Azure functions only. So this one was let's see, that's about half an hour. So that's about common. So that's kind of all I have here. Scope is definitely, it's definitely one of the hardest things to explain, especially to new writers, and even me, even seasoned writers. If you don't think about who the reader is up front and exactly what they want to know, if you don't know that, you're going to get scope wrong every time. So definitely the most important thing to come back to this is definitely the reader persona. The reader persona, if you don't know your reader, exactly what they want to know, and the title, where's the title at? But the title and the reader persona are by far and away the most important concept of scope.